Good evening, and welcome to what I know will be an exciting and engaging event. My name is Sion Beilock. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Psychology and Executive Vice Provost of the university. As you know, a core value of the University of Chicago is that of free expression and rigorous evidence-based debate and argument. It happens in class. It happens when the astronomy and astrophysics department debates whether they'll find life on other planets by the year 2042. It even happens when we argue about the superiority of the latke versus the Hamantaschen. The university is an intellectual destination that welcomes vexing questions and the thoughtful and challenging discussions they produce. We are at a time of heightened political uncertainty and tough questions abound. We therefore thought it would be a particularly opportune moment to hold an event where members of our faculty and thought leaders from beyond our campus could publicly debate one of these questions, specifically whether the political establishment has failed America. And we'd like that debate to happen in a way that involves your participation. We'll have more on that in a moment. I want to begin by thanking the Institute of Politics, the Center for Leadership and Involvement, and UChicago Grad for their work in conceiving of and planning this event. In that effort, they were joined by Intelligence Squared, a London-based organization that excels in producing debates of this sort. Please join me now in welcoming Hannah Kay of Intelligence Squared.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the introduction, Sian. I'm Hannah Kay, and I'm the executive producer of Intelligence Squared in London. We are so honored to have been invited to come here and stage this debate at the University of Chicago. Now, for those of you who don't know much about Intelligence Squared, we were founded in London 15 years ago, and we've made our name staging Oxford-style debates in which we bring experts, top speakers from all over the world to express their opposing opinions in this sort of structured format. And the idea is that they slug it out against each other, and then we get a result. Now, we've had some amazingly starry names on our stage, but as Sian says, one of the most important elements of our debates is you, the audience. And tonight we're going to be polling you before the debate starts and then again at the end. And we're also looking forward to hearing your questions. The Q&A is a vital part of our debate. It keeps the proceedings going. And I have on good authority that we have a very good audience here tonight, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Now it's time for the debate itself. I'm delighted to welcome an absolutely fantastic panel. We have two speakers here from the university, William Howell and Eric Oliver, and then two who've flown in specially for this debate, Michael Eric Dyson and Jennifer Rubin. And chairing the proceedings, I'm delighted that we have Mary Ann Ahern from NPC Chicago. So please would you give a very warm welcome to all our speakers. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Ann. So good to see you. What a great crowd here tonight. We're going to have a wonderful time. It's going to be fantastic. Hannah did not tell you something that I think is quite interesting. The debate topic, believe it or not, was chosen before the election results. Imagine that. And also this interesting fact. What? Donald Trump, just days before the election, one of his very final ads highlighted what he called the failed corrupt establishment, saying he wanted to stop that corrupt machine. They had delivered nothing at home and were a disaster overseas. That was then, this is now. So we have a new political establishment, and we have issues each day. My newsroom is buzzing every day. Who would think that the White House press briefing would be command viewing every afternoon? But it is. From the travel ban to the transgender bathrooms, to the drug prices, to the anti-Semitic actions, to the number of women in Donald Trump's cabinet, 4 out of 23. So tonight's debate could just not be more timely. Let's get started, and you are going to take part in this as well. Our topic, the political establishment has failed America. In a moment, I'll be asking you to vote on this motion using your cell phone. After that, we will hear the opening speeches of our speakers. And then I will announce, after their speeches, the results of that first vote. Then I'll be taking questions, so be thinking of your questions tonight. And we will encourage discussion and debate between the speakers. The speakers will then close the debate with a short summing up of tonight's topic. And then we will have one more final vote. So, here is our question. Get those cell phones ready. Has the political establishment failed America? For, against, or don't know? Here are your voting instructions. Using your smartphone, go to www.menti, M as in Mary, menti.com. The code you need to enter, 151442, and cast your vote. For, against, or don't know. Has the political establishment failed America? I will announce the results at the end of the opening speeches.
We don't have smartphones.
Good question.
We'll vote for you.
Can you log on anyway? Do you have a tablet that you might be able to log on to menti.com?
And what will these votes be used for? We use this poll. What will it eliminate?
It's mainly for this exercise to see. We want to see ahead of time where folks stand tonight before the speeches. We will be comparing it at the end of the speeches to whether or not perhaps they were very persuasive and maybe changed your view. So that's how the votes will be used. All right, has everyone cast their vote? For, against, or don't know? All right, let's get started. Our first speaker for the motion, Michael Eric Dyson. Michael is one of America's most distinguished public intellectuals. He is a professor of sociology at Georgetown University and an ordained minister. He just might hug you tonight. He has written prolifically on politics, race, religion, and music. His latest book is called Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America. He will be signing those books at the end of the evening, in which he urges whites to awaken to black suffering. Mr. Dyson, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you so kindly, Ms. Ahern. Has the political establishment failed America? I think you know the answer to that. Hell yes. Notice the question is not has government, qua government, failed America. We don't believe that. The permanent management of relations between citizens and the state, and the efficient management of interactions between citizens and their representatives, adjudicating competing claims about what is right or wrong, rival versions of the good that are asserted and established. We believe in that wholly and fully. But the political establishment, the particular administration of justice or injustice, the capacity of citizens to organize their dissent or their complicity or their consent with existing arrangements are a different matter altogether. We can love government, support what it means, the American democratic ideals that the founding fathers, though imperfectly, powerfully nevertheless articulated as the predicate for the expansion of the American dream and this rigorously presumed and pursued experiment in democracy. But this establishment, this political establishment has failed America. And politics in particular are about what? the delivery of critical resources in a time of crisis to vulnerable populations. The delivery of critical resources in a time of crisis to vulnerable populations, so that the state exists to serve the needs of the citizens, not to subordinate them. And we look at the political order right now, we understand that we are living in an infamous age of relegating the authority and the intelligence that are usually concomitant with the election of an executive chief to a toddler. The reality is that this political establishment has subverted the very principles that ought to be the predicate for our existence together as citizens. They have failed the people who most need the resources now. If politics, in one definition, is the delivery of critical resources to a vulnerable population in a time of crisis, who have they failed? They have failed women. We have a person in office now who believes in grabbing women's private parts and then blaming hip-hop culture for his errant ways. Please do not blame Biggie Smalls for your intemperate fits. Biggie said, some say the X makes the sex spectacular. If it's all right with you tonight, we're loving. That's the pursuit of consent as the predicate for reciprocal engagement. Women are reduced to persona non grata, continue to live beneath the level of many men who do the same job, 70 to 75% of a dollar what a man makes. This is not solely or exclusively the, if you will, the permission or the behavior or the responsibility of the state, but the state intervenes in such serious fashion and fails politically to observe the need to fight patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism. Who else are suffering? People of color are suffering, are being failed by this government. African American people continue to be within the matrix of radical inequality. The job performance of black people does not measure their employment. The unemployment of black people has routinely tracked and then doubled that of white brothers and sisters. So we know that, again, the state may not be exclusively responsible, but some of the public policies that have been put forth in the name of political conservatism have undermined, subverted, and distorted the capacity of these citizens to exist freely within the marketplace. Who else is being, if you will, disserved and failed? Muslim brothers and sisters and other religious minorities in America. We do not live in a Christian nation. This is not the Christian nation that the founding fathers imagined. They didn't imagine a Christian nation. They were not the evangelical pietists that many contemporary people who claim to be their legatees celebrate. Benjamin Franklin did not believe in it very much at all. When Thomas Jefferson took to the New Testament, he sliced away under the edges of a radical empiricism all of the miracles. This ain't your mama's religion. So that this is not a Christian nation. Martin Luther King Jr., as a Christian minister, sought to make this a better nation by using his religion to expand the parameters of justice. So many of our political figures have appealed to Christianity to shrink the dimensions of our justice and to reduce it to a narrow parroting form of Christianity that is neither powerful nor secure for our human community. Who else is being underserved? Young people. Young people are being failed by this government. Young people are seen as the flotsam and jetsam in life, marginalized, dogged, and dismissed because of their choices in hair or their earrings or their nose rings or their body staples or their ability to express dissent in American culture. They are demonized and dismissed, and yet they are the basis for the brilliant, beautiful imagining of a different future in America. Somebody wake me, I'm dreaming. I started as a seed, the semen, swimming upstream, planted in the womb while screaming. That is the existence of so many people who have been marginalized, but they see something better and brighter and more beautiful, and politics have failed them, and they have announced it with brilliance and not with bitterness and the determination to reorganize the logic of American democracy. Who else has been failed? the white working class that voted overwhelmingly for an ostensibly blue-class billionaire who has no understanding of or appreciation for the average white brother or sister in this nation. This president will not speak to you. The political establishment and order that he has organized around him is equally bigoted, vicious, insular, predatory, and incapable of imagining another human being being themselves or imagining themselves being somebody else. And so, my brothers and sisters, when we look at this political order, it has failed the American citizen, not only the white working class, but the average American citizen whose status will not be elevated, whose depth of commitment to our own government is not being encouraged because of the cynicism that has creeped into the relations between citizens and those who are their ostensible representatives. So we must declare that those of us in the embrace of the original ideals of the founding fathers and mothers must believe that this nation can get better progressively, but not without a serious dose of dissent, not without rejecting the political order that has failed to acknowledge the fundamental humanity of the citizens of the United States of America who are due the recognition of their citizenship by representatives who are not trying to impose arbitrary conceptions of democracy upon them, but listen to them, embrace them, and encourage them to live full lives under the public policies that are put forth, not public policies motivated by hate or resentment, or keeping Mexicans out, or banning Muslims, or demonizing women, or distorting young people, or putting a knife in the back of the average American white brother and sister. Malcolm X says there's no such thing as putting a knife in my back 9 inches, pulling it out 6 inches, and calling that progress. This is not progress. In American society, you and I are fully participating in a drama, an experiment that goes back to the founding fathers. What did they hope? What did they inspire those who came behind them to do? To take seriously the intimacy of our associations and to be able to reproduce the beauty, the power, the virtue of American citizenship. And in doing so, to be able to embrace one another as brothers and sisters in a common effort to make this nation the best that it can be. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the ideals of American society prevail, but until there is hope, there will not be a matching of our ideals with our reality. And in the end, the great philosopher Sean Carter, who was just inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, said, politics, no. Government, no. F government. People, government among themselves. The politics are for the people. That's why we must see that this government is strong only when we acknowledge that this particular political establishment has failed the ideals of not only us, but the great founding fathers and mothers who put them into order. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Our first speaker against the motion, Eric Oliver, professor of political science here at the University of Chicago. Eric's interests include contemporary American politics, suburban and racial politics, political psychology, and the politics of science. He has recently completed papers about public support for conspiracy theories, whether liberals and conservatives name their children differently, and conducting research on the biological foundations of political cognitions. Professor Oliver.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you all for coming out. It's a very hard act to follow. I was actually very nervous about this, and I spoke to my wife, Thea, and I told her about my nervousness. And Thea, she's really wonderful. She's very loyal and supportive. And she said, don't worry, honey, you're going to be great. And I said, but honey, I'm debating against Will Howe, and she knows Will, and Michael Eric Dyson, and she's seen him on TV. And she's like, well, I'm sure you'll do fine. And then finally, I told her, but I'm going to be arguing against the proposition that the political establishment has failed America. And she said, you're toast. It's easy to appreciate her point. The proposition on the table is powerful and alluring. And as our opponents will point out, there are plenty of reasons to think it's true. Whether it's the ongoing problems of racial discrimination, the growing chasm between rich and poor, or the chronic dysfunctions on Capitol Hill, it's hard not to suspect that at some core level, America's political leadership is clearly not working. Indeed, this proposition is so captivating, it helped propel an infantile, fatuous bigot into the White House. Throughout his campaign, Donald Trump ceaselessly invoked the political establishment as the principal source for all that is wrong with America, and that he alone, as an outsider, would fix it. Millions of Americans agreed. If there was a single theme that underlied Trump's unlikely success, it is the proposition we are debating tonight. And therein lies the challenge and the problem of the affirmative side. For when thinkers as smart as Michael and Will suddenly find themselves agreeing with Donald Trump, something is clearly amiss. Before I go any further, let me be clear about one important thing. Arguing against the proposition is not the same thing as celebrating the status quo. We are not here to say everything is hunky-dory in America. Whether it's issues of poverty, racial injustice, or environmental degradation, our country faces enormous challenges. But these challenges are not the proposition we have been asked to debate here tonight. The proposition we are debating tonight is whether the political establishment has failed America. This is a proposition, despite all its appeal, that we should be very wary of. For this proposition is emblematic of Donald Trump's worldview. Indeed, to endorse this proposition is to endorse Donald Trump's way of thinking. For the same type of thinking that asserts the political establishment is failing us also labels all Muslims as terrorists, that believes guns make us safe, or that assumes vaccines cause autism. It represents the same type of intuitions that tell us the world is flat, that all strangers are our enemies, and that our problems can be solved if we put our blind faith in a strong dictator. In short, the proposition represents the very impulses that are the enemies of liberal democracy. To explain this point, let me take a brief detour into the science of the human mind. Over the past few decades, psychologists have come to recognize that we are rarely as rational as we'd like to believe. The problem is, as the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Danny Kahneman notes, our minds are lazy. We may pride ourselves on the infallibility of human reason, but even our best thinking is usually chock full of errors. This is because of how our intuitive minds work. Rather than looking for the best answers, our intuitions look for the quickest solutions. It uses distorting shortcuts. It relies on stereotypes and fantasy. It confuses the internal reality of our hopes, anger, and fear with the external reality of the world. And in politics, the laziness of our intuitive thinking also gets us into trouble. It leads us to believe in myths and superstitions, to follow conspiracy theories and fake news, and for many folks, to think that a charlatan like Donald Trump is an honest and capable leader. The proposition we are debating tonight is emblematic of the laziness of our intuitive minds. Let me just give you an example. Take the subject, the political establishment. This is a favorite bogeyman of Donald Trump, but conspiracy theorists around the globe. The very term presumes a small group of power gropers with godlike omniscience and a singular intentionality. In reality, such an entity does not exist. American politics are far more complicated and pluralistic than such a single stereotype. Washington has multiple centers of political power with varying degrees of influence that shift with the electoral tides. Power is not shared just between Congress and the presidency, but with the courts, the bureaucracy, and state and local governments. These myriad groups are rarely, if ever, in alignment. Think about it. Do Bernie Sanders and Marco Rubio really work in lockstep? Are lobbyists for ExxonMobil and lobbyists for Greenpeace really in cahoots? Do Fox News and Rush Limbaugh really have the same goals as the New York Times and the Huffington Post? And are all these groups, which clearly fall under the umbrella of the political establishment, equally culpable for all that ails us? Of course not. In truth, when people blame the establishment, they are looking for a convenient and mythical scapegoat. Remember, our complex and multi-layered political system is shaped as much by historical forces and long-standing procedures as by groups of individuals. Its successes and failures must be viewed through the wide lens of history as much by the short view of contemporary politics. But most of the time, such a perspective is too hard for us to muster. So instead, we look to blame a singular entity. It's far easier to rail against a mythical establishment than to appreciate the safeguards of statutory regulations, the historical precedents of judicial review, or simply the challenges of ideological polarization within a system of divided government. This, of course, also makes the job for Jennifer and I much harder. For what we are asking you to do tonight is to transcend the natural tendencies of your own thinking, to look beyond the partisan or ideological impulses that lead us to fabricate such a thing as a political establishment in order to rush to sweeping conclusions like failing America. We must resist the impulse toward this type of thinking. Liberal democracy is the byproduct of the Enlightenment. It is the byproduct of reason. It relies on a bedrock of reason, deliberation, and dispassionate thought. It depends on counterintuitive notions about tolerating dissent and valuing compromise. The true enemy of liberal democracy is not the tyranny of autocrats. It is the tyranny of our own impulsive, error-prone thinking. Tonight, we offer you the opportunity to stand up for reason, to fight the cheap rhetoric of demagogues and propagandists, and to affirm our highest ideals rather than our base impulses. If you want to cast a vote in favor of the values of free speech, independent thought, and liberal democracy, then vote against the proposition on the table. Thank you.
Professor Howell, thank you. Professor Oliver. Our second speaker for the motion, William Howell, professor of the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics here at the University of Chicago. He holds appointments in the Harris School of Public Policy, the Department of Political Science, and the college. Mr. Howell has written widely on separation of powers issues in American political institutions, especially the presidency. He is currently working on a book provisionally called The Wartime President. It examines the impact of war on the power that U.S. presidents wield at home. Professor Howell.
Has the political establishment failed America? So let's be clear. What the political establishment is requires some definition. And it doesn't require us to think that it's a singular entity. And certainly saying that the political establishment has failed America does not require us to, if we come out in the affirmative, to say that then we're casting our lot with Trump and Trump's way of thinking. It requires us to think critically, absolutely, about what that establishment is, what it does, and to think about a set of evaluative criteria we might bring to bear in order to judge its performance. So I want to do a little bit of that for the time that I have. The case for this motion, it's worth noting, really has less to do, at least in the beginning, with argument, more to do with awareness. We don't need to be clever. We just need to be a little cognizant. What are we looking at right now? Well, for the first time in our nation's history, we just had a presidential election with both of the major candidates had disapproval ratings north of 50%. We currently have a former reality television show star with no political experience serving as president, wreaking havoc in D.C. Monday to Friday, and on the weekends playing golf, and when he's not attending to foreign crises from the public confines of the resort's dining patio. The president's chief advisor is a conspiracy-minded leader of the alt-right. Betting markets currently have Trump's odds at making it through his first term in office at about 50%. At town hall meetings across the country, apoplectic citizens are tearing apart chastened legislators. In 1964, 77% of the American public trusted the government in Washington to do the right thing all the time or most of the time. Today, it's at 19%. 74% of Americans believe that most elected officials put their own interests above the interests of the American people. All of 19% of Americans today believe that Congress is doing a good job. Washington, D.C. generally, and Congress in particular, is as it's always been, namely a feeding trough for special interests and lobbying groups. The ideological moorings of both of the major parties have all but disappeared. Republicans have become the party of nativists and plutocrats and a good deal of racists. And Democrats, who now are decisively the minority party in America, have lost their voice and vision for a whole host of issues from which they've once found energy, a sense of commitment to the poor, to the dislocated, and to the disenfranchised. And the dominant sentiments in American politics today are ones of anxiety, disillusionment, outrage, and disaffection. For this state of affair, you bet the political establishment is to blame. They're not uniquely to blame, and they're not equally to blame, but they have responsibility. And we need to be clear about the nature of that responsibility. For to do otherwise is to deny the possibility of leadership, to recognize that leaders in our republic have a role in structuring the kinds of debate we're going to have about hard issues and offering reasonable, responsible solutions. Just as to suggest otherwise is to deny the need for any kind of accountability. Look, there are massive literatures within political science which show that the capacity of average citizens to reason critically depends upon the choices that are put before them, and the choices that are put before them are structured by the two major parties. Just as there are big literatures that suggest the ways in which average citizens take cues off of political elites in order to figure out how to navigate a political space in which they don't have a whole lot of information, and they're trying to make their way. This mess that we have before us was not foisted upon us by the unruly masses. They may have responsibility too, but the motion before us is about the political establishment and whether or not they have responsibility. And there, clearly the answer is yes. Look, there are a number of ways in which we might evaluate the labors of this establishment. Let me suggest a few. One is we might think about the extent to which they represent the views, the things that the political establishment does represents the views of a broader electorate. We could think about that. We could think about the extent to which the political establishment fulfills basic normative objectives like justice or equality. We might, too, think about the extent to which the political establishment acts in ways that are consistent with the expectations of our founders. And there's a fourth one, though, which is namely the extent to which the political establishment solves problems. And I want to talk about that last one. We can be critical about all four, but that last one, for me, really resonates. Let's think about the political establishment's track record on addressing a few issues. The climate. 2016 was the hottest year on record. 2016. Replacing 2015, which previously was the hottest year on record, which replaced 2014, which was the hottest year on record. The climate is warming. Ask yourself, what is the political establishment doing? What is Congress, the presidency, the courts, our major parties, what are interest groups doing about this issue in a way that is responsible and that allows for us to actually move forward in a way that addresses this very real problem? The total national debt. Think about the debt now. Currently stands at $19 trillion. It's over 100% of GDP. We haven't seen these heights since World War II, and then we only saw them briefly. What are we doing about the debt? The tax code, unbelievably complex. If you look at the tax code, in 1940, the federal tax code was roughly 500 pages in length. Today, it's over 75,000 pages long. Nobody would write a tax code from scratch like the one that we have. What are we doing about that? Social Security reserves are declining. Right now, the trust fund looks like it's going to be depleted as early as within the next 18 years. What are we doing about that? And for the last 40 years, income inequality has been increasing such that the gap between those in the top 1% and the rest of the population is greater today than it's been in a century. You don't need to buy into Trump's dystopian view of the world in order to recognize that we as a country face real challenges. And assigning culpability to those people who are in positions of power to do something about these problems is not to buy into a Trumpian way of thinking. It's to come to terms with the very real challenges that we face. Let's be clear, there's serious and legitimate debates to be had about the purposes of government, about what constitutes a solution to different problems, about whether or not the government ought to play any role in addressing certain kinds of problems. The truth of the matter is, though, that we're not having those serious debates. Or more exactly, political elites are doing a miserable job of structuring those debates in ways that create space for citizens to enter into, to draw information about, to meaningfully engage one another. Watch the debates that are happening on the floor of Congress, the debates about what's happening on the floor of Congress on C-SPAN, and see whether or not you're enriched in your understanding about the challenges that we as a country face. Members of the political elites, they deny science rather than engage it. They act as though tomorrow's burdens do not exist and that we have no responsibility for the matter, and they debase our conversation rather than elevate it. What does then failure look like? Failure takes a number of different forms. Sometimes it takes the form of a refusal to fashion any response whatsoever to an observed problem. We do nothing in the face of mounting problems. That's one kind of failure. Another kind of failure is a refusal to learn from and update past efforts to address a particular problem. I would venture to say that we aren't seeing the kind of return that we ought to see in issues involving like health and education, where we spend a great deal of money, and yet there's a lot of evidence of failure. What are we doing about that failure? Not a lot. And sometimes what failure looks like is the passage of legislation that has these fantastic, glorious names that promise the world and yet deliver very little. Rather, what they consist of, for the most part, are cobbled together concoctions that are meant to buy votes of individual legislators so that they can satisfy the organized interests of back home in order to advance their electoral prospects. But they don't actually solve problems. There are a host of reasons why we don't solve problems. The parties today are as polarized as they've been in 40 years. In a century, and they've gotten increasingly so over the last 40 years. There's a sense in which legislators have lost their way. There also is a way in which the structure of our political institutions, by constitutional design, gets in the way of our ability to solve problems. What are we to do about this? Well, we need to think seriously about institutional reform. We need to think about how we might refashion our government in ways that allow us to meaningfully, artfully, responsibly solve problems. And so I would put before you, what are our political elites doing? What kinds of conversations are they offering about how we might refashion our government so that it can do a better job of meeting the very real problems that we face? And the answer is clearly they're doing close to nothing at all. What they do is they speak from their local, parochial, electoral concerns, and they do close to nothing when it comes to actually meeting the challenges before us. Is the political establishment failing us? You bet it is.
Our final speaker against the motion is Jennifer Rubin. Jennifer is a journalist who writes the Right Turn blog for the Washington Post, offering opinion from a conservative perspective. She covers domestic and foreign policy issues and provides insight into the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Jennifer previously worked at Commentary, PJ Media, Human Events, and the Weekly Standard. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be back with Intelligence Squared. I don't think they told Eric that I had done one of these before in New York for Intelligence Squared. I lost really badly. But perhaps Chicago will be the second try. I think Eric has done a marvelous job unending and upending the notion that there is a single political establishment. There is a thing out there, turning the dials, hoarding the wealth, making sure minorities and women are oppressed. It reminds me, our opponents that is, of the Adjustment Bureau, if you saw that movie. The principle behind that movie was that there's a little band of folk, and they zip in and out of buildings, and behind the scenes, twitching this decision, moving this one, this guy's car breaks down, this person gets elected, and they monkey with us so we have the illusion of free will, but we really don't. I don't think that's the way the real world works. I think that's a movie version. It's interesting that our opponents would give you an ahistorical, ethno- and America-centric view of the question. Because if you look at American democracy, American society, American economy. It is worse except for all the rest. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about a level of perfection, a level of human accomplishment that no society in the history of mankind has ever come as close to meeting as ours. And so the question before us, and I like that Will went back to the question because that's really the issue, is not should the political establishment be doing a better job, or is there too much inequality? It's the political establishment has failed us. And when I hear that, I don't know if you caught it today or not, Mr. Bannon was at a gathering of his alt-right friends, and he said his mission is to destroy the administrative state. He's talking about the establishment. It's democratic norms, it's democratic institutions, it's a free and separate press. It is the America that does not work for some people, but works better than any other system, and that we will miss terribly once it's gone. And I do wonder why we aren't failing more if the establishment is so clever. After all, Mr. Trump got elected, and he was not the choice of the establishment, was he? We may objectively think that he is, but the establishment was what he ran against. So how can it be both Trump and the other guys? That doesn't make much sense. I also want to take issue with this sort of reverse notion that we live in the worst of all possible times and the worst place on the planet. We are not perfect, but when you give some perspective, which is what a university education should provide us all, perspective, historical setting, and facts, you get a different picture. So let's talk some facts. Will talked about health. 1959, life expectancy was 69.9 years. It's now 78. 1959, about 30% of our country lived in poverty. Now it's 13.5%. Donald Trump likes to tell us that we live in a war zone. It's not true. This is the sort of catastrophizing, the sort of false dystopia. In fact, it's about the crime rate is about half of what it was in 1991. It doesn't mean there isn't crime. It doesn't mean that we have failed America. It means that we haven't eradicated crime, but we've done a pretty good job of reducing it substantially. We talk about the environment. You know, those dastardly elites are working on the problem. They did enter into the Paris Agreement. And what's more, if you look at non-gas greenhouse gases, we're at a point in human history that we've never attained since the beginning of the industrial age. Since the late 1970s, pollutants in the air have plunged. Lead pollution is down 90%. Carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide has been reduced 50%. By nearly every standard, the water we drink, the air we breathe is better. Is it perfect? No. But these are the results of imperfect human efforts to make our society better. But I'll tell you, if you want real inequality, if you want real discrimination, if you want real poverty, go to a country that isn't a liberal democracy, that doesn't have the rule of law, that doesn't have market economy, like Russia. Life is much worse there. In fact, it's much worse just about every place on the planet. You see, unfortunately for us, there is an arrogance of the present. All of our problems, like a teenager, never have been suffered by anyone else before. Our experience is completely unique, completely terrible, the worst of all possible worlds. But we know that simply isn't the case. Progress is imperfect. We have deep, deep racial, ethnic divides. What the president is doing with regard to undocumented immigrants is obscene. And yet, we don't have institutionalized legal Jim Crow in this state. We have a court in Washington state that issued an order, how establishment, the court system, and it stopped the president in his tracks. He'll try again, but we have a court system that is designed to contain people like Donald Trump. I wish there was a golden era that we could return to, or that we could go forward to, or some place on the planet that didn't have these horrible elites, and we could just, I don't know, make our own food and, sew our own clothes and all that kind of stuff. But in fact, a lot of what we're talking about is, I'm sorry, the inevitable result of complex, modern, globalized society. And there are trade-offs. When we elevate science, we lose faith. When we have independence and mobility, we lose connectivity. These are the ebb and flow of large historical forces that does not absolve us of choice and of responsibility, but it should empower us. It's easy to say things are terrible, they've failed, throw out the system. But what are you going to get without it? The Shakespearean line from Henry VI is greatly understood, killed the lawyers. Everybody thinks it's a dig on the lawyers. As a recovering lawyer, I know it's not a dig on the lawyers. What the point of the comment is that once you take away the architecture of society, at that time, was the most civilized society at least in the Western world, you're left with chaos. You're left with brute force. So careful what we should wish for about overthrowing democratic norms, democratic institutions, an independent press, a court system that does halt the executive. When we get down to it, it's only the arrogance of our own time that would lead us to believe that if we only wanted to, we could eradicate poverty. If we only wanted to, we could eradicate racism. These things are hard, but we are working on them. And we needn't absolve ourselves of responsibility, hand over our lives to the man on the white horse and in the orange face, and let him tell us that there's a nirvana out there in which all will be well. That's not how grown-ups in a liberal, small L democracy behave. Thank you.
All right, we've heard from our speakers. Here's the pre-vote before they spoke. As you can see, 65% of you here tonight thought yes, the political establishment has failed America. 24% has said no, and 11% don't know. We'll be taking another vote later this evening, but first now we'd like to get to your questions. We have folks stationed throughout the floor as well as in the balcony, and we want to make sure that you phrase your question as a question, not as a statement. And let's have you stand when you have your question, please. And we'd like to do several of them. If you're ready with a question, please raise your hand so we can get to you, because we want to keep this going, a great discussion going. So let's get folks throughout. Can I see where we are? Let's see. Let's go with 1, 3, 4. Number 1, please.
All right. Hi there.
Would you please stand?
Yeah, of course. Hi there. So my question for the panel is this. It seems like in both sides throughout the course of the election, and certainly ongoing now, has defined each other as being part of the very establishment that they claim to be opposed to. And I could offer, plenty of examples, but I'm sure that'd be an exercise in futility for our panelists. So my question for both sides is, how exactly do you define an establishment when that very term is being used as a basically linguistic ammunition for both sides of the political divide?
Michael, would you like to take that one?
Sure. It's an excellent question, by the way. And it is true that the language has been deployed on each side, but as was said earlier, not equally. There's a way in which, as you notice, our opponents resort to ad hominem. Slight, clever, curious, but there was no ad hominem on our side. We didn't resort to name calling about, oh, you must clearly believe in dystopia and that Donald Trump is part of the very establishment that you abhor. So when you hear people on each side talk about establishment, you're absolutely right. And our last speaker, of course, queried as to how one might be able to criticize the establishment when Donald Trump was not part of the establishment. Oh, but I do disagree. The feces excreted into the diaper that his tweets was fed to him by Eric Cantor, John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, and other established figures like Paul Ryan, who demonized poor people, who pathologized people who were not part of their particular ideological grind, who were not part of their party. It was much more subtle. It was much less obviously vicious, but that establishmentarian thinking fed and fueled the likes of a Donald Trump. Never forget, Frankenstein is the name of the doctor, not the monster. The doctor creates the monster. Donald Trump is, I hate to tell you this because I know many of you are not familiar with this. This is what people of color have been trying to tell you about whiteness. Now you got an example in Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the face of a revulsively innocent, an immature, infantile refusal to acknowledge grown-up theories, as you have said, and the refusal to do so seems to be displaced from the very people and processes that produced him, but they're not. He is just the most idiomatic, extravagantly evil, some would say, I would say problematic expression of what is a deeply entrenched reality. So yes, sir, there are accusations of establishment on both sides, but I would argue Martin Luther King Jr., when he said, I'm against the political order, said that there's a higher order. There's a deeper moral ambition that we should encourage in each other, and those are the kinds of things that I have in mind when I speak about that. It doesn't relieve us of accusing each other of the establishment, but ultimately I think sensitive, sensible, insightful citizens make a decision predicated upon their understanding of what really has been deeply entrenched and established in those things that are trying to get them in right order.
Jennifer, maybe you'd like to counter that.
Well, I don't think your question got answered because it was essentially, how can everyone be the establishment? How can this one be the establishment, that one be the establishment? We still have not heard the definition of the establishment. Is it the head of the FDA, the head of Greenpeace, Mitch McConnell, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi? At some point, the term becomes meaningless because it is. We have people of various political views, and by the way, Donald Trump and Eric Cantor don't agree on almost anything. So we can easily kind of slop it all together in one big mush and say the establishment. But who are we really talking about? And your question was perfect, because by saying the establishment, it absolves individual citizens of making distinctions, of making choices. This candidate is a better candidate than this one. This policy is a better policy than that one. Participatory democracy, citizenship, requires that we not simply lump everyone together and say they're all equally bad. That's moral relativism of a really heinous type. If everyone is awful, then no one is good, and no one's really responsible for anything. And I think that's been sort of our point.
All right, over here. Let's take question number 3. I'd like to hear question 3 as well as question 4 so we can keep it moving. So question 3.
So decades ago, America prided itself on bipartisanship. the so-called disjointed incrementalism, to set aside differences to make a difference. However, the recent politics is so toxic, so polarized, and people say that the best strategic long-term player in the world is China. So my question is, how can America still lead in the 21st century with so toxic political environment and so many veto points in the political system, and this disgruntled from the general public?
Thank you. As well as question 4, may we hear your question as well, and we'll get to them. Question 4. Yes.
My question is sort of a question about how historical your arguments are. So for the pro team, I'm wondering, is there a time when the political establishment was not failing America? And the opposite question for the other team, is there a time when the political establishment did fail America? And for both of you, sort of, if yes, can you point to sort of a time when it started to switch?
Thank you. I think we could almost combine those two questions together about the timing. What about that? Has there ever been a time when the establishment, when people weren't complaining, as well as his question about bipartisanship? It seems to go together.
So it's interesting, your question, which is great. In the 1950s, the American Political Science Association convened its most august professors together, and the crisis at the moment was the sort of lack of choice for American voters. The whole idea was that Republicans and Democrats seemed to be so similar you couldn't differentiate between them. How could we be giving our citizens meaningful choices when all we could really sort of see were like candidate personalities? And what we've seen in the past 5 decades since then is the polarization of American parties. The Democratic Party has become consistently much more liberal. The Republican Party has been much more conservative. Be careful what you wish for, is sort of the lesson of that. And I think the interesting question about, has there ever been a time where the political establishment has failed America? Let's go back to the beginning of this country and its nation. I would say, to take Michael's point, you could say that the American political establishment failed America from the get-go. This was a nation that was founded with slavery. Is that really, a country that, it's hard to imagine that we've, receded since then. We could even take this and take it to another level, which is like the whole idea that America and the political establishment are somehow another differentiated entities is also nonsense. That's kind of like sort of saying, water has failed the Pacific Ocean. This nation was created by what we might call the political establishment. The nation has always been in service of the political establishment. When we take a historical viewpoint, it depends really on your perspective as sort of a half full or half empty glass. It's easy to sort of say, well, the political establishment has always failed certain groups in the United States. It's always failed African Americans. It's always failed women. It's always failed the poor. It's a system that was set up to protect the privileges of the propertied white interests. But that's not what we're debating here. Or you could sort of see maybe no, we're not debating, Michael, we are not debating whether or not, a certain segment of white America has been systematically subjugating other groups of people. We are debating this notion about, has it failed America? And I think it's important to note some sort of historical criteria here.
Well, look, the fact is, the present president of the United States of America spent 5 years delegitimizing the previous occupant of the office as un-American, tried to retroactively abort him from the womb of American democracy and American citizenship. That's damn well what we up here talking about, number one. Number two, what's interesting, the answer is contained in your query, though, Brother Eric. And that is the fact that from the very beginning, America has been a failure. Only when it turns to the very people that it has failed to look for answers and remedies, that when it is wise enough, it listens to them. Martin Luther King Jr. was the grandson, great-grandson of slaves, enslaved people. The people he opposed were people who were in the majority culture. What did Martin Luther King Jr. say? He said to America in the last speech he gave, "Be true to what you said on paper. If you articulated it in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, whatever, the reality is," he said, "those ideals are the governing principles upon which American democracy expands." It took a failed experiment in democracy to be recognized by one of its greatest sons to rise up from the enslaved and in their legacy to point the way to a better America. After all, George Wallace doesn't have a statue in Washington, D.C. Martin Luther King Jr. does. And I think in that sense, that's the greatest success we can have.
And that should answer the question. That is a success. That's not an answer that America has failed. It's that we celebrate people who expand the franchise, who expand opportunity in this country. Are we at nirvana? No. But you mentioned President Obama. We elected President Obama, and some people thought he was a good president, some people didn't, but we did elect an African-American president. Was that a failure? Did the political class fail us by giving us President Obama?
No, I'm not arguing. I'm arguing.
William wants to get in here for just a moment.
Yeah.
I'm trying to help you here.
I yield my time to Dyson. Thank you. Go ahead.
To say that the political establishment has failed America is not to say that it has only failed America.
Right.
You can recognize that there are successes. You can recognize that progress is a possibility. You can also recognize that to say that it has failed America is not to say that we should eliminate it. It leaves open the question, what do we do about the observed failures before us? But we should come to terms with what those failures are and not play in these games of words that say, well, there's no such thing as a political establishment. That it is poorly defined suggests that it doesn't exist. And so the movement, I think, on the other side is to suggest they're not so much arguing that it has failed or succeeded, but rather that we shouldn't be asking the question. Because political establishment is this fuzzy thing. Let me suggest that it certainly includes Congress and the president and the federal judiciary and the two-party system and the institutions that govern their interactions. And we ought to then think about not do the policies that we observe, the actions that are taken reflect or not the interests of any one individual, but in those interactions and in those commitments, do we see meaningful progress being made in domains that are pressing, like climate change? And the answer, if you think the answer is no, I certainly think the answer is no. That's a failure, and we should come to terms with it.
All right, let's get some more questions from the group here. Do we have anyone else?
Right.
We're going to go with 5, and who else do I see here? Right down here, 5 and 4, and do we have one more over right here? 1. So 5, 4, and 1 in that order. So number 5, would you start first? Let's hear all 3 questions, and then we'll get some answers.
It struck me when what Professor Howell was talking about was a lot of those problems can be traced directly to movement conservatism, or the logical extension of such. And this isn't simply a Norm Ornstein and Mann argument. This is something that is the logical extension of decades and decades of what was post-war conservatism.
Your question, please.
The new right. So I guess the question is I'd like to hear the panelists talk about, is this not simply a failure of the political establishment so much as we have a rogue party that simply does not want to play by traditional rules of American politics?
All right, thank you. And we said 4. Would we have your question as well?
So my question is that even if we had so many progresses in like life expectancy and so, if people don't believe that the political establishment is working, if our state is working, electing people like Donald Trump, isn't that a failure in itself? Because if the liberal order cannot sustain itself by electing people that are vehemently against it, isn't it basically doomed to fail? And on the other side, if we are having so many progress, does it just qualify that we fail in particular areas, like some faith or like tax code, does it just say, well, life expectancy, the crime doesn't matter?
Thank you. And we had number one.
I think my question is similar to the one that the first gentleman had made mention of. And it's, you know, when you start to look at what happened in the financial crisis, there were a lot of norms and traditions that were broken that caused a lot of damage to a lot of people. But a lot of people did not go to jail. Actual laws weren't broken. When you look at what's going on in the White House now, or when you look at what's going on in political society now, tax returns are usually by tradition turned over by presidential candidates. They're not. You have people right now who are in the White House talking to the FBI about investigations that are going on. That is a long-standing tradition as something that we don't do in America. But did they really break any laws? And I think that is something, you've got Americans who don't know, who think laws are being broken, and those maybe should be.
And your question would be?
My question is there a real understanding of the fact that America's got a lot of traditions, but you have people who are breaking those traditions, and we think they're breaking laws, and they're not.
Thank you. So, Eric, you want to tackle these? Let's start with, we talked about a rogue party, we talked about the liberals being doomed, the tax code, and then what about breaking these laws? Can you give us?
In 30 seconds or less.
Wrap it up.
Well, I think if I'm trying to find a thread that unifies these that I can respond to in some way, and I think it goes back to what I would like to say earlier, which is this is an alluring proposition because it speaks to the political establishment becomes anybody who disagrees with me. And so I'm out of power, the political establishment is the man. He's, got his, foot on me. Sarah Palin would say, gotta get out from under the man. So, or, you're Sarah Palin and you're out of office. And then, the political establishment becomes Barack Obama and the Democrats. And I still haven't heard from our opponents. Will was valiantly trying to list off, I think, all of the components of the political establishment. But if you look at that group, that is such a diverse set of interests. It's hard to sort of say, well, there are environmentalists and there are, civil rights activists, and there are white nationalists probably in that group, and there are oil company interests, and there are banks, and there are social workers. All of these people are part of the political establishment, and we can selectively choose some of them, and sort of say those are the political establishment, and they're the bad ones, and they have somehow or another absconded with American democracy and sort of the rightful sovereignty of the people. But that's just kind of it becomes kind of rhetorically shallow and meaningless at some point.
You've heard that story, chicken and pig walking down the street, saying, let's each make a contribution to breakfast. Chicken says, cool, I'll give up an egg. The pig has to give up his ass in order to have breakfast. Now, that's the establishment, the chicken. When all you have to give up is an egg, when all you have to do is to produce an external result, when all you have to do is to think critically and as our panelists on the other side here, musing without being honest about their own privileges, rooted deeply in a persistent whiteness in America that fails to identify with others who have come here, those others who are the pigs, who have had to give their lifeblood. So there's no false equivalency here, but you're the establishment, I'm the establishment. When Barack Obama becomes the first African-American person to occupy the Oval Office, ain't no equivalency between him and 44 other men who have occupied that office. It was an aberration, to be sure. So in one sense, you could make the argument, look, the political establishment worked because Barack Obama was elected. What happens, of course, is what we fail to see. Barack Obama being the symbolic head of the government and becoming president doesn't remove prison industrial complex, doesn't remove the fact that most black men will, 1 in 4 black men will be put in the prison system. Doesn't remove the fact that unarmed black men and women are routinely murdered by police. Doesn't remove the fact that black and brown kids are expelled earlier from school. So the reality is that the pig-like existence of those people who have to give up their lifeblood to prove a point about the durability of American democracy is not equal to people who sit around and rigorously think about the possibility of American democracy. That's why I said at the end of the day, the failure of America has been redeemed by the people it enslaved, by the women that it treated as sexist objects, and the very things, the very pigs that they cast aside have now redeemed the possibility of American democracy so that that failure has been rescued. The people who have been failures are too much of a failure to recognize it, and those who have successfully tried to redeem the society have not been acknowledged and have been marginalized. That's the argument here. So there's no false equivalency between, well, we're all part of an establishment, what are we to do? There are better times. FDR was better. LBJ was better when he had the society that looked out for poor people, including poor white people. Those times were better than others when we were entrenched in our own narcissistic preoccupation and navel gazing like we're doing now with this infantilized presidency under a man who is incapable of acknowledging a scintilla of intelligence or a sentence structure that includes nouns, verbs, gerunds, participles, and the like.
Jennifer.
I think Michael just made our case for us. At times there's progress, and at times there's regression. And simply because we elected someone that very few people in this room probably voted for does not mean the system or the establishment has failed us. Will said something very interesting. He said, essentially, if you think there's progress, don't vote for us. Yes, there's been progress. I'm a white Jewish woman. Would I want to have lived in America in 1780 or in 1880 or in 1960? I don't think so. And the fact that we have an ongoing, this is the story of America, by the way, the ongoing perfection, the ongoing story of wrestling with these age-old questions of inequality, of justice, of fairness, of inclusion. But the line is clearly going in one direction. We had a Supreme Court, pretty establishment, that outlawed separate but equal. We had a Supreme Court that said, no, we cannot discriminate against gay marriage. We do go in one way. And in that respect, President Obama was right. We are on the side of history. And so progress is not steady. It's not assured. It's not without setbacks. But we are going in the right direction. If you want poverty, starvation, inequality, go live someplace else in the world or go back 100 years in American history.
But you're making our point.
Wait, Will wants to weigh in as well one more time.
While he's thinking, let me say this way. You're making our point. This is what I'm saying. All we're saying is those points at which you talk about that are the nadir, that are the low points, those are failures. The political establishment is failing us. We didn't say it was a permanent failure. It's an episodic interventionist failure. And when those failures occur, then people who have been externalized, who have been marginalized, help redeem and rescue the system. All I'm saying to you is that the failure is real, but the rescue is real as well.
I certainly didn't say, or certainly didn't mean to say, that if you can point to any successes, any progress, that then you should be voting against us. Right. To say that the American political establishment has failed America is not to deny the existence of progress. It's to say that it is failing to meet certain criteria, namely, what I talked about is a failure to meet very real problems, very real challenges that we as a country face. A thing that I like about this term, which our opposition is arguing against, the political establishment, is that it points our attention not to any one individual, but it encourages us to think about the relationships between them, to think about the structures that we have that govern how we as a polity make decisions. It's in those relationships that we see failure. It's in the divisions of the parties, the ways in which Congress and the president failed to meaningfully exchange ideas with one another and to press one another in the face of the larger public and in an effort to solve actual problems. That's a productive thing, so we don't go down this rabbit hole which says, well, who is the real source of the problem?
Right.
Who is it? Is it John, or is it Mary, or is it Bobby? Because as soon as we go down that route, we can always find some reason why, well, no, it's disproportionately somebody else. What we should be doing is saying, look, there are structural challenges that we face in our polity that we are not meeting, and we're not trying to adequately address. This is why I go back again to this issue about institutional reform. Think about the poverty of the discussions that we have as a country about what we might do about fixing our institutions and fixing our relationships. There's very little there. They're there even though our elected officials are eminently capable of reforming the very institutions in which they work.
All right, let's get a couple of more questions. We have 3 more questions. We'll go with 2, 3. Up. Where are you? I can't see you. 5. Thank you. 2, 3, and 5. So 2, 3, and 5. 2, would you give your question first, please?
So this is a 2-part question for both sides. When Jennifer was talking about the ahistoric argument that her opposition was making, I did want to make a point about causality. So how much can we take the establishment and ascribe progress to them? When I think of progress in public housing, I think of Jane Addams. When I think of the nadir of it, I think of our public housing policy now and the Jane Addams houses being torn down. When I think of progress in civil rights, I think of Martin Luther King. I don't necessarily think of any politician in the 1960s. When I think of the fact that Du Bois talks about how Reconstruction failed, and the fact that there was no goodwill reestablished between masters and freedmen.
And the question is?
The question being, is there a causality there in terms of, is this progress anything the establishment does, or in fact something the establishment has impeded? And the second part to this question is, does the establishment enable that by giving us the freedoms that allow for speech, business, and innovation that has allowed this country to progress?
Thank you. All right, over here. Did we say 3, 2, 3, and 5, I believe, upstairs. All right, number 3.
Hello, my name is Patricia. Hi, everyone. So I keep hearing in this debate the word forces, market, marginalization. And I want to make a connection between them. Or I want to ask if you guys see a connection between them. Why do the market forces allow white men to be at the top, with white women immediately after them, and then the rest of the population? I think that's a question that needs to be discussed. We're going to talk about democracy. Because democracy is a rule of the people, correct? And the people aren't just white men and white Jewish women.
Thank you. All right, our last question from upstairs.
This question is for Mr. Dyson and Ms. Rubin, since both of you are in the media a lot. How has the media apparatus on both sides of the political aisle played a part in the failure of the establishment to educate the populace? And do you think the failure of the establishment is more of a reflection of our own failure as citizens to understand our relationship to the government as envisioned by the founders? And shouldn't this debate ask the question, have we failed ourselves?
Thank you. Wow, we got a lot there. So, the progress that the establishment has made, as well as what about the forces, the market forces, and then finally the media. What's happened there? Why don't we start? I'm so glad I get to ask the questions and not answer. Go for it.
Yeah, I'll take a little bit of it, and I'll take half the time I was going to have so that Eric can come after me. First of all, the question about causation. It's the interaction between the populace and the government that makes democracy work. It's Jane Addams, but then it's the progressives who pass legislation to incorporate housing codes. It is, on one hand, gay marchers, gay citizens who come out of the closet, who put themselves on the line, who in some cases risk their lives, but then it is the politicians and the courts that are brought into the process. That's not a failure, that's the symbiosis, that's the way it's supposed to work. That's democracy working with individuals. And just briefly, I thought that was a great question. Part of the problem with the establishment is it lets all of us off the hook. 46% of the electorate elected Donald Trump. If 78,000 people had gotten off their couches in 3 states, we wouldn't have Donald Trump. There has to be a greater participation, a greater responsibility we take on ourselves for our own democracy. And ironically, maybe it took this disastrous election to spark that. You see people who have never marched before out on the streets. You see people who have never joined an organization join an organization. People are buying newspaper subscriptions, and may I say it's a wonderful idea and a good use of your dollar, because they realize I have to do something, and that's exactly the right reaction. We do have the power collectively, but we have to get off the couch.
All right. The media failing us, William?
Well, we've been asked about the political establishment. We might think about whether or not we want to include the media as part of the establishment. There's a conversation to be had there. We can also think about the ways in which we as citizens are culpable. That is, we play a role in electing people, obviously, who then fill positions of power. And so we too may be culpable. And in that sense, we too may have failed America. But to come out positively on the motion before us, has the political establishment failed America, is not to exclude those possibilities. We can say yes to those as well. Just as we recognize that there are some successes, just as we recognize that the failure has been sometimes peaked and sometimes not quite so peaked, all we've been asked before us today is whether or not the political establishment is meeting the challenges that we as a country face today. And I think there it's undeniable that the answer is no. And it is no, not because of any one obstructionist group, but because we have a political system that's set upon itself. And we have political actors who are tending to their local parochial interests. And we have a set of moneyed interests who play a major role in dominating the kinds of deliberations that we have. And that this collectively means that we have failure.
We have not attacked this question, though, Eric, the question about what market forces and why men so far ahead of everyone else.
Well, I mean, I think the answer to that is to be found in history. If you look at the history of this country, it was founded by a particular group of people from a particular group of Europeans. It was founded around their, aspirations towards a market economy and their sense of tolerance of economic inequality, and in fact, their embracement of slavery. So if you want to sort of say, well, why does our system have these inequalities now? Let's look back in time and sort of see, the roots of that, the patterns we see now directly are attributable to our historical past. Now, does this mean, I think that the challenge for us is to sort of say, well, does this mean our democracy is flawed? Is it inherently failed from the get-go? I think as Jennifer eloquently points out, look at the progress that we've made relative to where we've come. Look at sort of a number of people who have been lifted out of poverty here. I want to speak to Michael's point on this point too, because I think he makes a very compelling case that, if you look at who was it that was sort of challenging this trajectory of American patriarchal, classist racism and white privilege, it was people on the outside. And yes, we should acknowledge our heroes, our people who worked from outside the system to change the system. But I think it's also important for us to recognize the people within the system that we don't often see, the people who are invisible, the sort of, kind of modest bureaucrats. Take the example of vaccines. Vaccines have saved more lives in the United States over the past 80 years than almost anything. Can you name me who was the hero behind vaccines? No, the reason why, there are lots of heroes behind vaccines. There are local public health officials who, there are local political leaders who are advancing the idea that, let's take this counterintuitive idea of take this sort of, seemingly toxic system, stick it into your arm and inject yourself with it, and guess what? Your community will be healthier. So when we talk about progress in the United States, progress was not simply from the remarkable efforts of a few of our heroes. Progress is something that is shared across the system and largely advanced, I would argue, by people who are mostly invisible to all of us.
Can I answer some of that? So, because she asked the question specifically, I hate to quote Jennifer over here, but you ain't answered the question because you didn't even repeat what she said. She said market forces favoring white men and then right after that white women. I can understand why you might not want to answer that because it would not your existential reality. I'm talking about now the fact that arguments about failure and success rest upon the fact that we think that the market is a blind distributor of resource and good, that the market makes decisions on competing goods, scarce resources, and determines their distribution based upon objective criterion. When the reality is the question, really puts us in square in the face of history, Jennifer, since you said you don't want to be ahistorical. Well, if we're going to be historical, we've got to, as Eric has tried to do there, we got to acknowledge the fact that the market will always favor the people who determine what the market might mean. And that when you were sold on the market as an object of white fetish and curiosity and the extension of white economic power through slavery, black people were literally part of the market. They were sold on the market. Their testicles were examined. Their feet were looked at. Their bodies were reduced to persona non grata. So the reality is in the marketplace sold black flesh as a means of creating white wealth. That's not simply the past. When we look at the housing policy, the gentleman asked a question about, Chicago. When we asked about causality, you can talk about Berkeley, you can talk about Hume, you can talk about John Locke, the three figures who talked about causality and cause and effect. But at the end of the day, the causality there has to be this. White supremacy is operated to privilege and advantage some people and deprivilege and disadvantage others. That's just a fundamental fact. And it's not simply back in those days of slavery. Housing markets right now, the distribution of goods, the housing bubble. Why is it that disproportionate numbers of African American and Latino people lost their wherewithal? The greatest bleed off of black and brown wealth happened when the housing crisis occurred. So my point is there's not a kind of incidental relationship between the two. It's deliberate. And again, I'll end by saying this. I absolutely agree with you on this point, that it is not simply a heroic, iconic figure from the outside who worked. There are also inside people, but they're not all invisible, right? Think about Lyndon Baines Johnson, who really collared some of those, white racist senators and forced them to do the right thing in concert with Martin Luther King Jr. I would never argue against that. But what I'm arguing is that the failure to acknowledge the humanity of those people, to allow the market to determine their association to an American democracy was a problem. And only when it was challenged. I'm not saying it wasn't extended from within, but only when those brave souls, and it's not just a few, the masses of people challenged the hegemony of a white supremacist logic that made not only their state better, but they made America better. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just do something good for black folk, he revolutionized the American democracy to make it work better for everybody.
All right, it is time for the summary speeches. We are going to sum up our panelists. Each one will have a couple of moments. Again, the question is, has the political establishment failed America? We will begin with Jennifer.
Thank you again to the University of Chicago, all of you, our wonderful opponents, my partner, our great moderator. It really has been a pleasure, and if anyone thinks you can't have civil debate in America, they should come to the University of Chicago. One thing that Michael just said that was raised by this young woman, I think is critical to the argument that we are making. The most people, or the people who have most benefited from capitalism, are the 2 billion, with a B, billion people around the world who have been lifted out of poverty. As Bill Gates and the Foundation show, in the year 2030, we will no longer have any countries as a whole, we're not talking about individuals, as a whole, that are considered to be in poverty, operating on less than $1 a day. The lifespan of the average person on the globe went up 5 years in the last 10 years. And why is that? It's because we're making inroads on removing mortality, child mortality, infant mortality. These are the products of capitalism. And so while we have failures, we have done great successes. And it's not just America. I think we should look at humanity as a whole. I don't think we should be purely looking at our own position. I'll end on this. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, reading Michael Lewis's The Undoing Project. What he does is he traces the history of industrial psychology, of behavioral economics. And his point is that it's a central frailty, a central fault of human reason, that we attribute the dilemmas that we are in as the inevitable result of where we've been, and that we can predict the future based on what we have. That the world is rational, the world is predictable, and therefore if X is not happening, it's because some people don't want X to happen. And that's not true. The world is unpredictable, it's complex, it's messy. We make mistakes as a country, we make mistakes as an individual. But would you want to go back and live in America 100 years ago? Would you want to go back and live in America 50 years ago? They didn't have air conditioning in a lot of places, by the way. Would you want to live on another continent? I don't think so. So the question was not, although I think our esteemed partners would like it to be, has the political establishment sometimes failed, sometimes succeeded? Has it failed certain people? Has it not failed other people? That would be a defensible position. The proposition is the political establishment has failed America. And that's just not true.
Thank you. William Howell, you're next.
Well, I think we all, when we look up at Washington, D.C. now, we see a mess. We see two parties at each other's throat. We see various branches of government who are incapable of working with one another. We see a total incapacity to meet the challenges that we as a country face today about climate change, about comprehensive responsible immigration reform, about the debt, about entitlement reform. We don't see responsible debate about these issues, and we don't see a concerted effort to try to attend them because our politics are dysfunctional. Our politics are dysfunctional. What are our politicians doing in order to try to attend to that dysfunction? What they're doing, for the most part, is digging in. They're not stepping back and saying, how might we relate to each other anew? How might we reform the institutions that govern our daily lives? There's no work in this particular domain. And that constitutes a singular failure. There was a time in the progressive era when a lot of people got together and said the machinery of government isn't working to meet the challenges of our day. And so we need to do something in order to attend to the issues associated with changes in the economy, the emergence of the United States on the world stage, rising immigration. We need to refashion the machinery of government. There was a shared recognition that the machinery of government, the establishment, was failing. And they set to work at doing that. There's no such work like that going on today. And so the layering of the failure is profound. There's a failure to meet the challenges that we face, just as there is a failure on the part of people who are in positions of power to refashion the institutions that govern our lives in ways that would allow us to meet those challenges. It's twice over. The work isn't happening. We should call failure failure.
Thank you. Next, Eric Oliver.
Once again, thank you all for coming out and for your wonderful questions. In Western Europe, reason first died in the year 475. This was the year that the Greek philosopher Proclus recorded the last astronomical observations of the ancient world. For the next 1,000 years, Europeans abandoned the scientific study of the stars and nearly everything else. The deductive proofs, empirical research, and reasoned philosophy of classical Greece, along with its democratic values, were displaced by the unquestionable tyranny of kings and popes. The Western mind slipped back into the realm of myth and superstition. Civilization in Western Europe declined, and life again became nasty, brutish, and short. It wasn't until the Enlightenment that Europeans reclaimed the science of their classical forebears, and with it the means to challenge arbitrary autocracy. In the 300 years since, the West has enjoyed an unprecedented rise in the human condition. By any measure, more Americans are living longer, better, and freer lives than at any time in their history. Such gains are largely attributable to the scientific and philosophical advances that came with the resurgence of reason and the application of that reason towards democratic governance. Now, I think the important thing to understand about reason is that words matter. The only way that we can reason properly is if we have clear understanding about what our words mean. We've argued back and forth tonight about sort of the meaning of words, but I would say that the problem with the proposition is that it's just an inherently fuzzy and flawed proposition. We haven't really even come to terms with what we mean by the establishment. We haven't come to any terms by what we mean by failure. I would argue we don't even have agreement about what we mean by America. So when we can't agree about sort of the basic words in terms of the proposition, it's really hard for us to have any kind of reasoned debate. And the only default that's really available to us is to not sort of just imprint our own hopes, desires, or sort of perspectives on what we think the proposition should mean. We need to reject the proposition. In an era of fake news, lies, empty rhetoric that's coming from the White House, I think it's really important now that we stand up for words, that we stand up for truth, and that we stand up for meaningful, reasonable ideas. So please vote against the proposition.
Thank you. Finally, Michael Eric Dyson.
Sounds good. Bertrand Russell said that the purpose of education is to resist the seductions of eloquence. And our eloquent friends over here certainly have made a case, but if reason was the only principle, the best people would be the smartest people. But we know that ain't the case. Martin Luther King Jr. said, he long ago deconstructed that. W.E.B. Du Bois said, in the embrace of a kind of enlightenment and rationality, that if the best people were the smartest people would be doing the best things. But often they use reason to justify and to legitimate their essential injustice. So you can talk about a European conception of reason as if that is the only point. You could say what was going on in Africa simultaneously while they were smelting iron ore while Europeans were playing in caves. It would be interesting to do a contradistinction between those two to broaden your perspective, your Weltanschauung, so that it would be inclusive and global. A young man who played basketball here named Michael Jordan said he took 9,000 shots, said he lost 300 games, said he was trusted 26 times to take the winning shot and lost. He said, I failed and failed and failed again, and that is why I succeeded. You cannot win 6 rings without Scottie Pippen. You cannot win 6 rings unless you recognize when you have failed. If you fail to recognize your failure, you can't correct. If you fail to recognize when you have done wrong, you can't do right. And with all due respect to my professors on the panel, students come to you, but I got a 58%, so 58% I got right, but I still flunked. I still failed. You can have 0% or 58%. You still might flunk. As I said, Malcolm X said, don't stick a knife in my back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches and say, well, that's progress because the knife is still in my back. I believe this is an incredibly powerful, great nation. James Baldwin said, I love this nation above any other. Therefore, I reserve the right to criticize it perpetually. And when you apply criticism to the America, I think you all have fallen into the trap of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a nationalist, not a patriot. A nationalist says my country right or wrong. A nationalist says my country could never fail. A nationalist says this political system has been perfect all along. But a patriot says, no, this system has failed, but there is the potential to revive and to restore and to give back the redemptive character of our American citizenship. That is what we believe. That is why America is great. Not again. Donald Trump's making America great again harkens back to a time where women were in a household of domestic intranquility and African-American people were marginalized and poor people were invisible. I want to celebrate an America that acknowledges those failures, that refuses to live in what Gore Vidal called the United States of amnesia and joins the kingdom of memory. This is a great nation if we recognize the failures and do something to correct them at the end of the day.
All right. So, thank you to all of you. We want you to now take your final vote. Again, the motion before us: has the political establishment failed America? For, against, or still don't know. Your voting instructions: use your phone, go to www.menti.com, the code 151442, and please cast your vote. For, against, or don't know. You have 1 minute to take that vote.
If you're in Chicago, you can vote twice.
It has been so interesting tonight. I think one of my favorites, actually, so many as I took notes, but our minds were certainly not lazy tonight, Eric. That was one of yours. And I think that it was so interesting, all of the discussion. It's really been a pleasure to be here to hear all of it and to see so many folks engaged. So, the voting is over. We are going to give you not only, let's see what happened, not just the final vote. We want to compare it to, of course, the vote from earlier tonight, the pre-vote. And it really, the Intelligence Squad, what a treat to have you have come here to Chicago. This is your maiden visit trip here, and to have come to the University of Chicago, to have offered this opportunity to all of us here tonight. Really, Hannah, is just very special. We appreciate it so much. So, as soon as we have that vote total, I think it'd be interesting for all of us to see. Did we persuade, did all of our folks here tonight, were there any minds persuaded? Was there a change? Was there a swing percentage? I believe we started out, it was 65%, but at the final, here we go. So the pre-debate, 65% had said yes, 24% had said no, and 11% don't know. And now our final vote. Oh, well.
I think we killed it.
Yes is 63%. No is 24%. And we have moved those who don't know. I don't know how you look at it, but perhaps they're kind of with them. Maybe, I don't know. We'll have to decide.
No.
But
that ain't what it's saying.
We want to thank the speakers. We want to thank the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, and of course, Intelligence. And just a moment.
Shit. By 20 points for 10.
We'd like to let our panelists leave. Of course, Michael Eric Dyson will be signing books in the back in the lobby. Thank you all for being here. Let's let our panelists get out of here first. And thank you very much. What an enjoyable evening.